I'm pleased to be here, and it's not often that the AFL-CIO is actually in sync with our own government on trade issues, but the issues I'm going to talk about today, we actually have some things in common, so that'll be unique. I've been asked to address Mode 4 in the transportation sector. As the only panelist from the U.S., I'm also happy to answer questions when we finish about the AFL-CIO's larger positions on TISA and any of these other agreements under negotiation. Mode 4 essentially is immigration policy, and we've long opposed Mode 4 as part of GATS, as part of the WTO. The movement of natural persons, we really don't feel is a trade issue. It's a social policy issue, and it's something that we feel is a very poor idea to lock in visa commitments in trade agreements that cannot respond to the actual needs of the people who are migrating from one place to another to do the work. The GATS Annex on the movement of natural persons specifies that the agreement does not apply to measures affecting natural persons seeking access to the employment market, nor does it apply to measures regarding citizenship, residence, or employment on a permanent basis. And I just want to take these in turn and talk about why we feel it would be inappropriate to include Mode 4 in TISA. So regardless of what the GATS purports to exclude, when workers cross borders to fulfill functions for firms, they have achieved access to the employment market, and the employment market is necessarily thereby affected. It's impossible for it not to be affected. If a trade and services agreement can authorize the movement of persons for employment purposes, but it refuses to take responsible steps to ensure that these persons can exercise their fundamental labor rights, for instance, by including a labor rights chapter and commitments, which I'll talk about a little bit, if it refuses to recognize that these people have human rights and that their rights towards residency and citizenship actually impact their ability to exercise their labor rights, then you have a nightmare scenario. And you have this scenario acted out and experienced by migrant workers in places like the United States, but also in the Dominican Republic, in Thailand, in Jordan, all over the world, because you've got migrant workers who are unable to exercise their rights. In the United States, obviously, we've had for a long time an employment market that's attractive to those who aren't U.S. nationals, but our variety of alphabet soup visas and work permits, including H-1Bs, H-2As, J-1s, and et cetera, they add up to a system where migrant workers who are dependent on their employers, not only for their jobs, but for their right to stay legally in the United States. And that system is used by bad actor employers to really game the system, to keep wages down, to limit the ability of workers to speak up and exercise their rights. And it ends up hurting both the U.S. national workers as the employment market gets flooded with people that the bad actor firms are allowed to pay below market wages, and it hurts the migrant workers. Statistics collected by our Department of Labor, as bad as they are, give some indication of this, and that these visas for firms that want to bring over their folks to do the work for them have been used to lower wages in the particular sector. They bring folks in as low-skilled, and then even though they stay in the United States and get their visas renewed over time, they're never given raises commensurate with their experience. So it really tends to keep the wages down and suppressed. And there are stories, of course, that everyone here should know about labor recruiters charging exorbitant funds to lure impoverished workers, only to have them discover that the job and the wages aren't what was promised. Sometimes they find out that their passport and their other travel documents are being held hostage by the employer. Sometimes it's the workers themselves that are being held hostage by the employer. And many learn that if they speak up for something as simple as a raise or a safe workplace, they may be out of a job and out of the U.S. immediately. So how much worse would these stories get as countries commit to more and more visas in trade agreements? Visas that the legislatures back home cannot adjust according to labor market circumstances. As we understand it, TISA negotiators have no plans to include an enforceable labor and human rights protections in the agreement. This is something that the United States has done in past FTAs, starting with the very weak and basically non-enforceable side agreement with NAFTA, getting stronger and stronger to those commitments. If those don't come along with the TISA, we think that will be a huge failure. And our current congressional silliness and government shutdown notwithstanding, the U.S. is actually now closer to immigration reform than it has ever been. And the immigration reform law plans include making sure that all immigrant workers can exercise their workplace rights, that their visas are not simply tied to a single employer who can control them, that Congress can adjust the numbers of visas on a regular basis to respond to labor market conditions, and making immigration commitments separately in the TISA could really derail the momentum that effort has, and it really could ensure that these workers who have been subject to abuse and wage and labor rights suppression will not get that fixed. So this is something where our government has said we are not interested in Mode 4 commitments in TISA to the extent that that's the case. We support that. With respect to transportation, similarly to the presentations on healthcare and other public services, it's a public service, and we strongly believe that governments need to retain the right to provide it when that's their choice, to regulate it when that's their choice. Obviously, there are all kinds of issues in terms of safety. This is, the daily commute for most people, how they get to and from work. So it's really, if your businesses are going to function, if your labor markets are going to function, people need to be able to get to and from work. We, of course, as workers in the United States, have particular special interests regarding our transportation sector. And transportation sector is still one in the United States that creates good middle-class unionized jobs that you can get without having a college degree. And we don't have that in a lot of sectors in the United States anymore, and we don't want to lose them. And that's why we oppose modifying the Jones Act or including air transport services in the TISA. The AFL-CIO strongly believes that the open skies agreements, which are negotiated separately than the WTO and the TISA and all of our free trade agreements, are the right way to go with opening up the air transport sector. And the United States has more than 100 open skies agreements in force. We also support the right to maintain ownership and control rules that require U.S. ownership for U.S.-based airlines. Many countries have an assortment of ownership and control rules for various parts of their public services, and there are good reasons for this. In doing some research for this presentation, I was reading the history of the privatization of British Rail, and it was pretty interesting about the privatization, the renationalization of a portion of it, and the recent studies that show that the private companies that now run parts of British Rail are really state-owned enterprises that run the transportation system in France, in Germany, in Holland, and that the rates that British Rail passengers pay are really subsidizing the lower fares in these other countries. They pay about a third of the ticket prices of British Rail. So what might be really beneficial for passengers in France and Germany and Holland, British citizens might have something else to say about whether they want to be subsidizing those ticket prices. And the more that the sector is open to privatization, as theirs is, the less they really have a choice in that. So we do believe that this is a critical sector that countries must maintain the policy space to control or to regulate if they privatize. Under the scenario in which all services must receive national treatment, as has been discussed as the framework for the TISA, any remaining limitations on ownership and control, such as the United States still has in the air sector and other countries have in various sectors, they're under attack and they might not survive the process. As a final note, on the importance of public transportation and the ability to regulate in the transport sector, I just want to raise a current application that is before the United States, and to think about, if this was in your country and whether or not you would want this to be a rule that would be challenged under the TISA. There's a tour company called Miami Nice Tours, which recently applied to the US government to hire 50 European backup drivers for large tour buses capable of transporting 40 to 42 passengers at a time. Miami Nice asks that these drivers who hold no United States driver's licenses be exempt from that requirement altogether. And as a consequence of that, they would be exempt from other things like having to supply a driving record so that we'd know this person's driving history at all. They would be exempt from undergoing drug tests that go along with having the US driver's license for this sector. And I think that we would all agree that none of us would want to compromise traveler safety just so firm X can make more money. Yet the ability to treat such applications on a case-by-case basis, we think is an important right that the US government maintains. Is that case-by-case right something that somebody would see as a non-tariff barrier and be challenged under the TISA, depending on what was committed? So I think these are important issues to consider, important issues to raise. And when we I was reading a WTO working paper from 2008 talking about Mode 4, and it was talking about the flow and stocks of natural persons. And these are the kinds of things that give trade unions pause. There are not flows and stocks of people. There are flows and stocks of widgets. And when we're talking about the TISA, we're talking about human lives and workers' lives, and we would ask everyone to keep that in mind. Thank you.